So as we begin or move into the calving season or prepare for the breeding season, I think it's a timely topic to start thinking about some nutritional management to prepare for the breeding season. So when a producer calls me or wants to talk about some nutritional management, one of the first things I want to mention or bring up is their forage base. And so for a cow-calf producer, that's your number one priority. And so one issue we run into quite a bit is limiting the intake, and especially before going to grass. And we run into a lot of problems with it, especially even in drought situations where when we start limiting the cow's ability to eat all she wants a given day, we start seeing a massive decrease in production. And so you think about some drought situations where preg rates have dropped. A lot of times the reason behind that could have been due to not so much the quality of the forage, but more the quantity that was there. So unless you're in a limit fed situation where you're in a dry lot where we can develop a limit fed ration to meet their requirements, limiting intake is not a good thing. The second question we typically ask is about the cow's requirements. Where are they at? The physiological stage, their body condition score, where they're at in pregnancy or in lactation and gestation, when's their breeding season. Age is a big one, especially in the younger cows. If you think about their nutrient requirements, even though they're smaller or growing, it could be less. Those nutrient requirements are typically more important, and they're a little more sensitive to if they're not meeting those requirements. Climatic stress is a big one. There's a lot of research done on climatic stress in the feeding industry. That the same impact that heat stress, cold stress has on feeders is the same stress that a cow herd will have. And so that's something really pay attention to. And then activity. In some environments, activity is massive. Some areas, cows walk up to 15 miles per day or more. So if you have large pastures, your activity could be driving an increase in nutrient requirements. So when we think about how cows will utilize nutrients, they're going to utilize them a little differently depending on what's driving that need. So when they consume that energy, form that forage base or that feed stuff you're feeding them, the first place it's going to prioritize it and partition it is to body maintenance. That's just to maintain their body function. The next place is for reproduction, and this is not reproduction to get pregnant. This is to maintain a pregnant animal. This is to maintain that fetus. And then early, before she's bred, lactation. And lactation is a massive driver of nutrient requirements and nutrient needs. So as lactation increases or the amount of milk she's milking increases, that just increases the amount of nutrients that she has to maintain for lactation. And that comes before getting pregnant or cycling, that the nutrients needed for actually getting pregnant. And so if we're selecting for maternal traits as milk production and calf weaning weights, we're selecting against, in a lot of environments, selecting against reproduction. And once those lactational demands are met, finally it goes to pregnancy, of getting those cows cycling, getting all those cows pregnant, and then some body weight gain and actually putting on some body weight. And so really when you want to focus on nutritional management, lactation is a massive driver in a cow-calf herd in a limited nutrient environment such as we have here in Nebraska, we really want to focus attention on selecting for animals that actually fit our environment, and not selecting for something that it will be a massive driver away from reproduction. There's two main areas that we want to focus our nutritional management on is that we have increase in nutritional stress for our beef herd, and one is late gestation, about 60 days after calving. And so really that's a critical time point, not so much for the cow itself, but a critical time point of supplying the right nutrients and the right amount of nutrients for fetal growth. So there's a lot of fetal growth that occurs during that late gestation time point, and there's some really good research out of Rick Funston's lab that has shown that the benefit of supplying the right nutrients on influence calf weaning weight. And so that's a critical time point, not so much for the cow, but for that subsequent calf crop. Then early lactation, about 50 to 100 days after calving. So peak lactation for a beef cow is around 58, 60 days. And for most part, that's right around the time point we're going to start moving into a breeding season. And so we have the highest nutrient requirements at that time point as we're moving and preparing to go into a breeding season. And so that's the time point we really want to focus, make sure our nutritional management is up to par to influence pregnancy rate in cows. And so I tell producers this quite a bit, but if there's a supplement that will change animal performance in the future, we really want to feed it. And so as long as the marginal revenue outweighs the marginal cost. And so we always have to take in the fact that if it costs too much, it's probably not going to be worth feeding something. Let's say you have on average 92, 93% preg rates overall in your cow herd. It's not always worth feeding additional supplements to bump up to 94, 95. And so finding that optimum balance of nutrition and reproduction is critical in optimizing your cow-calf production. And so some key performance responses that we really want to target for nutrient management is day's first estrus. And that's extremely important, especially for younger cows. Getting younger cows cycling as early as possible and bred as early as possible. And then, influencing pregnancy rate, which ties into calf weaning rate that following year, but also we can target some supplementation strategies that will help with weaning weight of the calf. And mostly that's due to some fetal programming of feeding the right supplements during late gestation that can influence the weight of that subsequent calf crop. One strategy that I want to bring up in terms of optimizing is in economics, there is the diminishing returns curve. And so this study, the slide is a good example of that. This was a stocker study that fed up to 4 pounds per day of a crude protein supplement, and they looked at stocker average daily gains. And so they found the maximum average daily gains was about 2.5 pounds per day of this supplement. But if they backed off 33% and fed 3/4 pound per day, they had 50% of the response. That's a very efficient response with feeding much less. And so if we talk about a optimal and efficient supplementation strategy, this is a good example of sometimes it's worth feeding less to get a more efficient and optimum response. So in our cow herds, reproduction is the main factor limiting production efficiency. It's also 5 times more economical trait than a lot of our maternal traits is milk production as calf weaning weight, calf growth. So and some large economic databases, some benchmarking databases. They've shown that calf weaning weight only has about 5% influence on profitability. And so, but reproduction has, so optimizing reproduction with nutritional inputs has 5 times more economical important than that output trait of that calf itself. So we really want to focus on how can we increase and optimize our reproduction performance through a nutritional management without increasing our production costs. So this is a slide of some longevity data that was out of USDA Center in Miles City, Montana, that looked at how they developed heifers and the longevity of those heifers. And so this data goes out to 6 years of age. So we have yearlings and up to 6 years of age. And so if you develop heifers and you had 90% pregnancy rate in your heifers, then you just lost 10% of those heifers that you developed, which is pretty common. And so in this data, they have 90% pregnancy rate in heifers. As 2-year-olds, what if you get 90% as well? And so that means that you just lost, you're down to 20% of those heifers you developed are now out of the herd. And then as a 3-year-old, that's even a more significant drop off. And then it finally stabilizes as a 4-year-old. And so when you think about it, the cost of developing and keeping those young cows is tremendous when we have large decreases and drop-offs. When that stability in the cow herd, it's so low during the early time phases. We really want to focus on 2 areas in management: is how can we get more of these heifers that we're developing, that we're selecting for our cow herd, stay in the herd, and through either heifer development or the management of the 2s and 3-year-olds. And so Matt Stockton, the ag economist here at North Platte, has some data that shows that how we develop heifers in our unit cost of production and our replacement rate, it can take up to 13 years to pay off the cost of either buying a heifer or developing our heifers. And so we really need to focus on how can we develop our heifers that we increase our longevity and retention, that we're actually profitable with them at an earlier age, versus in these scenarios it's taken 8 to 13 years for they're actually a profitable animal in our cow herd. So a lot of this presentation, this talk, will be about reproduction in the younger female. And so I segmented this into a pre-calving, so selection of heifers, heifer development area. Then once we get those heifers or younger cows pregnant, prepartum management, late gestation management, and then moving into some post-calving management, and then some genetic selection, how that ties into the pre-calving and late gestation and post-calving management of cows. So this is a study that was done here at Nebraska. It looked at age of when a heifer was born on influence on her productivity as a heifer calf, as a developing heifer. And so they segmented this in 21-day periods. And so the oldest set of heifers would be in the first 21-day period, and the youngest heifers would be in the third 21-day period. So if we look at just 2 or 3 areas here, if we look at percent cycling at start of breeding, the older they are, we have an increase in cycling at start of breeding. A pregnancy rate is increased with that older heifer, not a big difference between the oldest and the second oldest group, and then you have a pretty good drop off by the third. But what's really important here is that percent that are calved as a first calf heifer in the first 21 days. So 81% of those oldest heifers are calving in the first 21 days versus 69 and 65%. And I'll show you a reason why this is extremely important in this next slide. So this will take that study a step further and looked at date of calving as a first calf heifer on on their long-term retention in the cow herd. So this was some data that's done here at the Clay Center Gestation, and basically block them in similar 21, 22 day blocks of when they calved in that first calving season. And really, there's not a big difference in retention and longevity between the ones that calved in the last two blocks. But we see a big increase in longevity by the heifers that calved earlier in that first calving season. So if we can get heifers bred as quickly as possible, just increases their opportunity to stay in the herd longer and just be more profitable long-term for a cow-calf producer. So this is a study that we did at New Mexico. It looked at developing heifers two different ways. First way was developing heifers on our native range that we're going to call range here, being fed 2 pounds per day of a 36% crude protein supplement that was 50%, made up of 50% rumen undegradable protein. And so that RUP supplement, that high bypass protein supplement, would be a protein type that would bypass degradation of the rumen microbes and would be absorbed at the small intestine as it was fed. So this would be similar to feeding like a distiller grain cake or corn gluten meal. And then the other diet was a commercial growing diet, a feedlot diet to gain about 1.5 pounds per day. So very traditional heifer development to gain a very moderate 1.5 pounds per day. So it started in February, terminated, it started breeding 1st of May, so about 100 days of difference in these treatments. And then they went into a 45-day breeding season. So if we just look at body weights, no difference in body weights in January, and then it started breeding in May, there's about 100 pounds difference in the heifers that was sent to the feedlot. So in New Mexico, they finally get their monsoonal rains starting in May and June, and so up to that point they're grazing dormant native range. And once those monsoonal rains come in May and June, get a green up, and it really flushes those heifers out, and they compensate from that restricted gain prior to that point. And they really take off, started breeding, and by the time they palpate for pregnancy in September, there's no difference in body weight between the two development types. One thing that we do with all young cows, whether it's heifers and heifer development or 2 and 3 year old cows, would be that right before the start of breeding season, we will move them to a fresh, ungrazed pasture. And what this allows is that if it's a dormant pasture that may be a little lower quality, it allows them to select. And when they can select, our data shows that it's about a 200% increase in quality at that time point. So that was equivalent in our data to us feeding 2 pounds per day of a 40% crude protein supplement. And another avenue would be if you have sub-irrigated meadows, is that regrowth. If you grazed them before and coming in on that regrowth during that breeding time, it's a much higher quality than it was first time you grazed it. And so you can utilize your grazing management as a supplementation strategy to help flush at critical time points of these younger cows. This is the data from moving into ungrazed pasture, ungrazed dormant pasture. And so what we find is that the digestibility of the forage they select in that really short time point. So moving into the ungrazed pasture, digestibility of that forage was about 75%. Within 2 weeks of grazing and within 2 weeks of them selecting for the higher quality forages out there, it drops down to about 60-65% and maintains that for the next few weeks. And so if we utilize our grazing at a critical time point, going into breeding, we can utilize it as a way to increase the nutrient supply at the time of breeding, and maybe increase, especially if you're using a timed AI protocol, increasing the percent of animals, younger animals, that are getting bred by timed AI or just earlier in that breeding season. Going back to the heifer development study, this would be the pregnancy rates that we found, is that the range developed heifers had a 94% pregnancy rate, feedlot group had 84%. So how we developed those heifers and how we utilized our environment in our grazing management, we increased pregnancy rates by 10%, even though our nutrient inputs were much lower and a much lower restricted gain. One thing that we did also with this, we followed those out to 5 years of age to see if we influenced their longevity or their retention rate in the cow herd. And so at 5 years of age, we have 68% of the range raised heifers left in the herd and 42% of the feedlot group. That's a massive difference in retention rate by how we managed heifers for 100 days. They came out of the same cow herd, same genetics, but we manipulated their environments by taking the one group out of the feedlot or out of the their native setting, put it in a feedlot, and increase their nutrient plant nutrition for that 100 days, changes their lifetime productivity. So one thing that we believe, and Rick Funston here has some data to support this as well, that how we develop heifers kind of sets them up to how they can handle being that first calf heifer and that second calf heifer. How we develop those and manage them really sets them up to be look like more adaptable to experiencing that stress of lactating for the first or second time and trying to get rebred. And so that's something to keep in mind, is how we're managing heifers for to be a 2 and 3 year old. In the dairy industry or in the literature, they talk about an area called metabolic imprinting. And so what it is you imprint an animal to a nutritional plane at a key critical time point in their life. And so we think this is a good example of that. Is we took that feedlot group out of the feed or out of that native range, put them in the feedlot at an increased average daily gain that they would not experience again, and then expected them to perform in a much lower native or much lower quality and plant nutrition the following years. And so they've never seen or never would experience that type of nutritional plan again, and they didn't perform as well from then on. And so we believe this is a good example of imprinting those animals early on to the plant nutrition that they're going to be experiencing as a young female. Another good example of this is, so in the herd, Harriet Goodmanson went from a March-calving herd and then moved some into a May-calving herd. So if you think about the plant nutrition, the quality of forage between that March-calving to May-calving is, at the time of calving, nutritional quality is much higher for that May-calving in May. However, when they move into a breeding season, it's the opposite, where the March-calving herd is rebreeding on a much higher plant nutrition, and the May-calving herd is breeding on a declining plant nutrition. And so what we found was with these 2-year-olds, after moving, is first 4 years, pregnancy rates dropped. So on average, it's about 80%. After a few years of selecting animals within that system, within that herd, we've started selecting for animals that have experienced that. And so in the last couple of years, we've seen an increase in pregnancy rates in that May-calving herd that we didn't see before. And I think this is a good example of they've now experienced that plant nutrition. We're now selecting for animals that have the ability to rebreed in that plant nutrition. So let's move on to late gestation management. So once we get that cow bred, how should we manage them to optimize really that fetal programming side? And so this is a study of ours from mature cows, and this is one reason why I'm really focusing more on the younger females versus mature. And so this is a late gestation supplementation project that we fed for about 60 days. Late gestation, we fed either 2 pounds per day of a cottonseed meal cake, so that'd be a high rumen degradable. So a lot of that protein is going to be degraded by the rumen microbes, and so they got fed 2 pounds per day. The next treatment group got fed a 1/4 pound per day of a high rumen undegradable protein source. So this is a good example. I talked about diminishing return curve and finding that really efficient response. And this is a good example of that only feeding a 1/4 pound per day of a protein. And then our last treatment got no supplement during late gestation. So if we look at their body weight change during late gestation, 2 pounds gained 12 pounds, 1/4 pound gained 4 pounds. Very efficient body weight gain with just a 1/4 pound per day supplement. And then the no supplement group lost 30 pounds. But when we look at pregnancy rate in these mature cows, pregnancy rate doesn't change. So even with not feeding any supplement during late gestation and allowing those cows to lose body weight, we didn't see a change in pregnancy rate. And this holds true with, there's been several studies with mature cows that have found a similar response. As long as that is not extreme, we don't see a change in that subsequent reproductive performance. So with that, there's some opportunities that we can utilize some body weight as a supplement. And so we can, if we plan it and not allow too much of it, we can utilize that body weight as a energy supplement. A lot of times our forages may be inadequate to meet their energy needs during late gestation. And so if we utilize it well and plan it and not let it be too extreme, we can allow their body weight to be that body condition score, the additional reserves to be an actual supplement. And it can be a very efficient and cost-effective supplement. This is another example of that. This was a study with mature cows during late gestation, and we looked at body weight change. And so first treatment group lost 55 pounds of body weight during late gestation. The second group maintained body weight, and the third group gained 55 pounds. When we look at their subsequent reproductive performance, and going back to that idea of using their environment and let them compensate, and that timing of when we flush them out has a big impact on reproductive performance. We find that the group that lost body weight during late gestation had the greatest pregnancy rate, those and the ones that maintained body weight. The ones that gained 55 pounds got over-conditioned. And going to that breeding season, the direction that they're going may be opposite or not enough compared to the direction of body weight change for the loss or maintain group. So if we can get cows gaining body weight as quickly as possible during or going to that breeding season, it just has a massive impact, a positive impact on that pregnancy rate. So we know two things may be limited from our forages in our native range. One thing is the type of protein that's being absorbed by the cow may be inadequate, and so these some of these diets that we're feeding, maybe a higher rumen degradable protein source, it may be inadequate to meet their actual needs for certain amino acids by feeding something that's being controlled by the rumen microbes. The other thing is there's an imbalance of acetate to propionate ratio in our rumen fermentation of our forages. And so when a cow consumes that forage, that rumen microbes will break those down to the short chain fatty acids. And so acetate is our energy source. And so it's the short chain fatty acid that really is the energy for the cow. And then propionate, it'll be the glucose source for the cow. Unlike us, once we consume or eat lunch or dinner, we'll have a spike of glucose. And so a cow will never have this spike of glucose because about 95% of the glucose from fermentation of that forage will be utilized by the microbes. And so the cow has to make its own glucose. It's made in the liver by with this propionate. So the propionate is the predominant glucogenic precursor for a cow. So the problem is our diets are imbalanced, and there's not enough propionate in the diet to meet the needs for glucose. And the issue runs into, to be able to utilize that acetate as energy, you have to have glucose. And when there's an imbalance at certain time points, these cows will turn into like a type 2 diabetic. And so kind of in similar, be like a gestational diabetes. And some of it's driven by diet quality, and some of it's driven by lactation and the demand for glucose. But when we have this imbalance, we basically create situations where cows are diabetics. So this is a late gestation study that looked at feeding either no supplement during late gestation, a rumen degradable protein source, or rumen undegradable protein source during late gestation. And so this is 2 winters in Montana. The first winter was pretty mild. The second winter was pretty harsh. Several feet of snow, negative degree days. No supplement during that harsh winter. It lost about 100 pounds. So it's a pretty harsh winter. Rumen degradable protein during that winter lost 40 pounds. But when that rumen undegradable protein source during that winter basically maintained their body weight. So during times of high stress, we find that feeding supplements that are high in bypass protein, that are high in rumen undegradable protein, have a massive benefit of helping cows get through the high stressful times. This is a good example of when I talked about feeding a supplement that will have a future effect. And so this was a study that Trey Patterson did for his PhD research here at Nebraska that was done at the Rex Ranch, that they fed yearling bred heifers during late gestation. They fed them either a supplement that was high in rumen undegradable protein or a supplement that was rumen degradable protein. And what they find is that the rumen undegradable, that bypass protein, increased pregnancy rates that following breeding season versus rumen degradable protein. And so feeding these high bypass supplements can have a big benefit in future responses as well as versus feeding a rumen degradable protein source. So let's move to after calving. So gestation length in our cow herds, give or take, is about 280 days. So we really need cows to recover and rebreed somewhere around day 80, 85 day postpartum. The issue runs into, especially the young cows, is a majority of young cows will be hard pushed to recover and start cycling by day 80. And so we really need to focus on how can we get these cows cycling as early as possible so they can maintain a calving interval. If we go back to that slide of when a cow calved on its longevity, the earlier we can get those cows cycling and recover from calving, just increases their opportunity to stay in the cow herd longer. And so one way to do that is if we can get them gaining body weight as soon as possible after calving. Go back to that study where cows lost 55 pounds body weight during late gestation. They rebounded after calving more effectively, compensated by being thinner, and pregnancy rates were increased. And so in the dairy literature, they talked about body weight nadir. Body weight nadir is the time point from going from losing body weight until it start gaining body weight. And once they hit that point, within 10 to 12 days, they find that those cows will start cycling again. And that's pretty similar to what a beef cow will do as well. Is once we start getting cows to gain body weight, then it just increases the opportunity for her to start cycling, get bred quicker. So pregnancy rates in our young cows can be the lowest in our cow herd. And that could be a 2-year-old, it could be a 3-year-old, depending on the environment you're in or how you manage your cows. But it's largely due to their inability to consume enough energy from that forage. And so they're lactating for the first time, they're thin, they're trying to regrow. And so there's a lot of stress and pressure on a young cow to get pregnant in timely fashion when they've got a lot of things going on. And they just can't consume enough energy in our forages to meet all those needs so they can start cycling again. So a lot of research that we focused on is how can we shorten that postpartum interval? How can we get cows to cycle quicker to increase that cow opportunities for that cow to conceive, and especially conceive earlier on? And so we focused a lot of attention on partitioning nutrients away from lactation so they can go to her body for growth and maybe to start cycling earlier. You know, I talked earlier about how cows partition nutrients, and lactation comes before body weight gain. It comes before reproduction. And so if we can partition nutrients away from her lactational needs, we can increase that amount of nutrients going to her body to increase the opportunity for her maybe to start cycling and get bred quicker. Going back to the slide again, this is why it's important. We can get cows to cycle earlier, get pregnant earlier, just increases their longevity in the cow herd. This is an older study that looked at prepartum nutrition level and then postpartum nutrition level. So for the prepartum, they had 2 different levels, either a low level, not meeting their needs, or a maintenance level, meeting their body weights. Go back to that slide of the body weight change during late gestation. This is a similar study. How that low level would be like those cows losing body weight during late gestation. Postpartum nutrition level, they have low versus high. So we look at low, that postpartum interval in these mature cows was 73 days. Low-high, flushing those cows out, even though nutrition level before calving was low, by giving them the right nutrients after calving, decrease that postpartum interval by almost 20 days. So massive influence on when those cows start cycling again. Maintenance low and maintenance high, really no change in the postpartum interval. And so we can get away with nutrition levels that are lower, that's not meeting their needs during late gestation, if we supply the right nutrients after calving and get those cows gaining body weight as soon as possible and compensating from that low nutritional level prior to calving. This is a good example of that. This is a study that looked at cows after calving gaining 1 pound per day versus 2 pounds per day. And they looked at when they got pregnant in basically a 60-day breeding season. And so in the first 20 days, and then the first 40 days, and by day 60. And so by just gaining 1 pound more per day in the orange bars, they increased the percent that got pregnant in that first 20 days by nearly 20%. And so that's a big difference in when those cows got pregnant by just gaining 1 pound per day. So if we can get cows gaining body weight as soon as possible after calving, and going into that breeding season, we can really influence that timing of when they get pregnant. So this is a study of ours that I talked about. There's this imbalance of acetate to propionate, so there's really this inadequate supply of glucose. And so this is a study, a 7-year study with 2- and 3-year-old cows that we fed 2 pounds per day for 70 days postpartum after calving, either one of 3 different supplements. The first one being a cottonseed meal cake supplement. So that would be a high rumen degradable protein supplement. The second one would be a 50% bypass protein cake. And so this would be like feeding 2 pounds of a distiller grain cake. And then the third supplement was that bypass cake plus 40 grams per day of a feed additive called calcium propionate. So calcium propionate is utilized a lot in the dairy industry at calving, that they'll give a large bolus to cows at calving to keep them from being ketotic, to supply on that additional glucose so they can oxidize and utilize that acetate as energy. So if we look at days of first estrus, so that time point from calving until they start cycling, really no difference between rumen degradable supplement or rumen undegradable supplement, but 6 days, 5 to 6 days decrease in when those cows with that calcium propionate, the additional glucose, started cycling. So you may think just a week. A week is not much, but when we look at pregnancy rates, we increase pregnancy rates from 7 to 11%. And so by adding 40 grams of a glucose source, we really have this tremendous impact on when those cows start cycling and when they get pregnant, and increase those pregnancy rates. So what we know is going on here is that in the dairy cows, there's this high correlation between reproductive performance and this blood metabolite called ketones. And so what they find is that early conception cows have the lowest ketone concentration, then late, then non-pregnant had the highest. And so we've utilized this quite a bit with our beef herds with this ketone meter. So you may know a diabetic that has to measure their ketones. And so this is similar to a glucometer, but we've measured ketones at the chute with just a drop of blood to see where their ketone status were prior to going into breeding season. And what we find is that early conception cows, so these cows would be actually cows that conceived at timed AI, had the lowest ketone concentration versus late conception cows. And so, and I've done this study. This was in New Mexico. I've done this study in Montana, and then in Tennessee as well. And they all hold true that cows that get bred at timed AI, young cows that get bred at timed AI, will have a lower ketone concentration than cows that get conceived by a cleanup bull later on during that breeding season. So this ketone concentration is really influencing when cows are getting pregnant. If we look at body condition score, no difference in body condition score when those cows got pregnant. 4.5 pre-calving, 4 pre-breeding. So they were thin cows, but no difference in pregnancy rates, or no difference in when they get pregnant by their body condition score. So body condition score is not a very sensitive measure on reproductive performance. So if you look at milk production between early and late conception cows, these early conception cows, although it wasn't significantly different, they did have a lower numerically amount of milk produced. And so what's going on is that those nutrients, instead of going to milk, are being utilized by that cow to get pregnant. And so if we could partition nutrients away from milk, will allow cows to get pregnant earlier in that breeding season, and just, especially in these younger cows, give them an increased opportunity to stay in the herd. And so outside of calcium propionate, there's a couple other options to utilize as a glucogenic precursor. And so this is 5 studies using ionophores, whether or not it's Bovatec or Rumensin, and look at a postpartum interval. And so all 5 studies have shown a decrease in postpartum interval by feeding ionophore. And so the ionophore will have the same influence as increasing the amount of propionate, ruminal propionate, so that cow will have increased glycogenic supply. So let's quickly move over to some genetic potential and how that will influences especially these younger cows. So I talked about, the need for us to start, well, one, partition nutrients away from milk. Also, there's a massive need to start selecting against milk and that maternal trait. So I spent quite a bit of time in Tennessee and New Mexico, and just to compare the environment systems there, Tennessee, high rainfall, high forage rate, the cow types are high growth, high milk, nutrient inputs, 100 to 150 days of feeding corn silage, really moderate energy protein supplementation. And then New Mexico was everything on the extreme end. Low rainfall, moderate growth, low milk, very low to no nutritional inputs, and a year-long grazing situation. When we look at the production, see, Tennessee is almost double the milk produced versus New Mexico. Cow size in Tennessee was about 300 pounds heavier mature cow body weight versus New Mexico. Calf weaning weight, only about 40 pounds increase in calf weaning weight. By some of that due to that milk production, a lot of that's due to actually just cow size and selecting for more growthier animals. And we look at that conversion, the conversion of pounds of milk to calf, it was about 25 pounds of calf weaned per pound of milk in Tennessee, 43 pounds of calf weaned per 1 pound of milk in New Mexico. So really going from forage to milk to calf is extremely inefficient. It's extremely inefficient use of those nutrients of actually putting pounds of calf on. And so that calf is not going to utilize those nutrients from milk as efficiently as milk increases, or so selection of milk increases. When we look at pregnancy rates decreased in Tennessee. Even with feeding that high quality roughage source, high energy, we couldn't meet the needs of that milk production, and we see a decrease in milk production or decrease in pregnancy rates. Longevity is decreased in that herd in Tennessee, and then there's about a 300-pound increase in cow size in Tennessee. So what we're selecting for in our cow herds need to really be focused on fitting our environments and optimizing what our environment has to offer and the nutrient inputs that we can give to really optimize that performance, that response, that output response. This is a study of one of my grad students was when I was at Tennessee that looked at level of milk production in about 240 Angus cows and looked at cow-calf performance. And so we used the actual milking machine that milked them like they were dairy cows to look at their the amount of milk that they produced. So a low milking animal was about a 12, 14 pounds per day milk. Moderate was about 22 pounds. And the high was 25 to 30 pounds of milk. So as milk increased, no difference in time to age pregnancy rates between low and moderate, but decreased for that high. And so even in this high quality environment, those cows milking 25 plus was not reproductively competent. Looking at overall pregnancy rates, same thing holds true. That those high milking cows still, even feeding that high quality roughage diet, they still could not produce. And so if we're selecting for milk in limited environments, we're really going to start seeing a decrease in performance due to our inability to feed through that demand. So in conclusion, management early in life has long-term implications. What we do today can have a big impact on performance and profitability down the road. And so one thing we really need to focus on, early conception increases the opportunity to increase longevity. Nutrition at time of breeding is the most critical timing. So we can get away with some limited, restricted prepartum nutrition management as long as the nutritional level at the time of breeding is high enough to elicit a response. We have to get away from selection of milk production. And then it's not the amount of what we feed, but what we feed. And so we can be very strategic with feeding certain additives or certain feed types and have a big response on some of the key responses that really influences profitability of a cow-calf producer. So with that, I would gladly, if you got any questions, please email me. My email is travis.mulliniks, MULLINIKS, @unl.edu. And thanks for listening.